what I thought about the music and not just say, this is what you're going to record. And and he'd always said, if you don't like the song, I mean, you're going to be singing it. So you better like it. Crystal Gayle called herself the Accident, the youngest of 8 kids born into a Kentucky coal cabin where meals were thin beans and scraps. Her father coughed black dust until he collapsed when she was 8. She spent years living in her famous sister's shadow, hearing whispers that her success was borrowed. But something changed. After decades of 61 inches of hair, dragging across stages and causing her real physical pain, after grief that never fully healed, Crystal made choices nobody expected. What her life looks like now in Nashville will surprise you. The woman behind that hair is nothing like the image. Crystal Gayle came into the world with a name that did not sound like it belonged to a star. She was born Brenda Gayle Webb on January 9, 1951, in the hard hills of Kentucky. She was the youngest of 8 kids, and the house they called home in Butcher Hollow was a small cabin that shook in winter and baked in summer. Coal dust floated everywhere. It settled on the porch, on clothes, on faces, and it even seemed to settle on hope. Food was never enough, so meals became a routine of thin beans, cornbread scraps, and whatever greens could be pulled from the hills. There was no indoor bathroom, only an outhouse out back. And on cold nights the family pressed together under quilts, while wind slipped through the cracks and whistled like it was searching for warmth too. Because she was born when her parents were already worn down and broke, Brenda grew up hearing jokes that did not feel like jokes. She called herself the Accident, not because she wanted pity, but because she could feel the strain her arrival added to a house already running on fumes. Still, even in that struggle, something bright was taking shape. Neighbors did not have money either, so they traded what they could. Sometimes it was food, sometimes it was help, and sometimes it was music. Their living room could turn into a tiny stage, and the kind of night that started with worry could end with laughter. Brenda was so small she was barely steady on her feet, yet she would sing anyway, and the grown-ups would listen like the song itself was a kind of bread. Her mother, Clara, worked until her hands looked older than they should. Her father, Melvin, everyone called him Ted, went down into the mines. He did it again and again because 8 kids still needed to eat. The mines gave him a paycheck, but they also gave him something darker. Dust filled his lungs year after year, and that black lung sickness took hold. By the time Brenda's memories were forming, her father's breathing already sounded like a struggle. He coughed so much that the sound became part of the house, and the rags he used would stain with black phlegm. He was tough, but toughness did not stop the damage. It only helped him hide it for a while. Then the ground under the family shifted again. When Brenda was still very young, the Kentucky mines shut down, and the little income they had disappeared. So they packed up what they could and moved to Wabash, Indiana, chasing factory work and hoping doctors could help Ted. They ended up in a worn miners' colony where the houses sat close together like tired boxes. The hills were gone. The creek's swims were gone. Now there were flat streets, factory horns, and a new kind of loneliness. Brenda's accent softened as she tried to fit in, but poverty came along for the ride. The food stayed scarce. The clothes stayed patched. The shame followed her into school, so she learned to keep her head down and her feelings even lower. And then the worst part arrived. In 1959, Ted collapsed from a massive stroke. Brenda was only 8. One moment he was there, the next he was gone. And the house that already felt fragile suddenly felt empty, in a way she could not explain. The funeral passed, and something strange happened. She did not cry, not because she did not care, but because her grief turned inward and locked itself tight. It began showing up in her hands, in nervous movements that she could not control, and in habits like biting her nails until they bled. She grew quiet and withdrawn, as if speaking might crack her open. Clara tried to help the best way she knew how, and when she took her to a stern doctor, he gave Brenda a sharp command to stop. That harsh moment did not erase the pain, but it jolted her into holding herself together in a new way. She learned how to look fine while feeling anything but fine. Clara did not have the luxury of falling apart. She was widowed with kids still at home, bills still coming, and no soft landing waiting. So she worked. She took jobs that were exhausting and thankless, and she kept taking them. She cleaned, she helped, she did whatever paid, and she did it while still trying to keep a family standing. Brenda watched all of it. She watched the tired walk. She watched the early mornings. She watched the way her mother pushed through because nobody else would. That kind of survival teaches a child something sharp. It teaches you that love can look like sacrifice. It teaches you that quitting is not always an option. While all this was happening, one person in the family seemed to belong to another world. Loretta Lynn was 19 years older, already married young, already stepping into fame. To Brenda, Loretta was both a sister and a distant legend. That distance created a quiet ache. She did not get the normal big sister comfort because Loretta's life was moving fast and far away. So Brenda grew up with a gap where guidance could have been. And later, when Brenda began singing for real, that gap turned into something else. It turned into a shadow. When the music business finally reached for her, it did not reach for Brenda first. It reached for Loretta's little sister. People introduced her that way. People talked about her that way. And even when she tried her best, the comparisons kept coming, like she was being measured before she even spoke. Loretta helped her, and that help came from love, but it also came with a weight. The same connection that opened doors also made it harder to walk through them as her own person. That tension did not always show in public, but it lived in the background, building quiet resentment and quiet hurt. So, Brenda made a choice, and it was not an easy one. She stopped trying to sound like someone else. She stepped away from the lane people kept pushing her into. She leaned into what was natural for her voice, smooth and soft and different. And that was the start of her real life. Not the life built from family stories, but the life built from her own decisions. By 1974, she had spent years recording songs that sounded so close to Loretta's style that even radio people got confused. Her biggest early single, "I've Cried the Blue Right Out of My Eyes," did not break her out of the box. It only proved she could survive inside it. But surviving was not the same as winning. She was tired of being introduced as a copy. She was tired of hearing that her success was borrowed. So she walked away from that setup and signed with United Artists, even though some people whispered it was a mistake. That move changed everything, because it placed her with producer Alan Reynolds, who heard what others ignored. He told her the truth in a simple way. Her voice was too smooth for the rough mold they kept handing her, so they shaped a new sound, softer and more radio-friendly, the kind of sound that made traditional folks roll their eyes. Yet that sound fit her like a dress she was meant to wear. At first, the change did not look like a miracle. The early songs did not explode overnight. But then, Wrong Road Again arrived, and it did something important. It proved she was not a clone. It climbed the charts and stayed there long enough for people to stop talking about Loretta for a minute and start listening to Crystal. That was the real shift. Because once a listener hears you as you, They do not want you as anyone else. Then came the song that sealed it. Don't It Make My Brown Eyes Blue did not just succeed. It spread. It crossed lines that were supposed to stay closed. Country and pop, Nashville and beyond. It became the kind of song that plays so often, it starts to feel like it has always been there. And when she won a Grammy for it, the message became impossible to ignore. The girl from dirt floors and patched clothes was not visiting the spotlight. She owned a piece of it. After that, the story kept rolling forward like a river that finally found its path. Hit after hit followed. People stopped saying Loretta's little sister and started saying Crystal Gayle. She built a legacy that stood on its own legs, and she did it with the same grit she learned in those early years when nothing was guaranteed. Even her need for stability, the need that began when her father was taken too soon, showed up in the way she lived. She held on to love. She held on to consistency. She held on to the kind of life that did not vanish overnight. Crystal Gayle's famous floor-length hair did not begin as a publicity trick. It began as something much more personal. In the late 1960s, when she was still a teenager living in Wabash, Indiana, she made a quiet promise to herself that she would never cut her hair again. She was only 16 then, still carrying the weight of a hard childhood after her family had moved from rural Kentucky following her father's death from black lung in 1959. Life at home had never felt simple. There were 7 siblings, very little peace, and always the long shadow of Loretta Lynn hanging over everything. So when young Brenda Gayle Webb, who would later become Crystal Gayle, decided to let her hair grow, it was not really about beauty at first. It was about control. It was about having one part of her life that belonged only to her. That choice stayed with her. It grew with her. And before anyone in the music business understood what it would become, it had already become part of who she was. Her mother, Clara, had once pushed shorter, more polished styles, but Crystal moved in the other direction. She held on to softness, length, and a kind of quiet defiance. By 1970, when she was 19 and signing with Decca Records, her hair had already reached her knees. In Nashville, where people were used to neat bobs and safer looks, it stood out right away. Still, Crystal did not build her image around it in the beginning. She simply lived with it. And over time, it became impossible for people to separate the woman from the hair. Then fame arrived, and what had started as a private promise turned into a public signature. After her breakout success with Don't It Make My Brown Eyes Blue in 1977, the image became unforgettable. On tour in the late 1970s, her hair swept the stage floor while she sang to sold-out crowds, and fans could not stop staring. It gave her presence before she even opened her mouth. It made people lean forward in their seats. Some whispered from the front row, wondering if it was fake. Crystal usually laughed it off. She knew the questions would come, so she met them with charm. During her CBS special in 1979, she joked that it was all hers and that it grew an inch a month. The crowd loved it, and that little line told people everything they needed to know. The hair was real, the image was real, and so was the woman inside it. As the years passed, the hair kept growing, and it stopped being just a striking feature. It became a full part of her legend. By the early 1990s, on her 5'2" frame, it truly reached the floor. Reports later measured it at 61 inches, which meant it fell around her like a living cape. It was beautiful, but it was also inconvenient in ways most people never had to think about. On stage, it brushed the ground. Backstage, it caught on knobs and snagged on anything it passed. In trailers, she had to pin it up just to move around. During performances, she had to keep track of where it was at all times. especially in heels, because one wrong step could turn it from glamour into disaster. That was the hidden side of it. The same thing that made people gasp also made life harder every single day. Caring for it took real time and real patience. She brushed it in sections. She avoided heat tools. She let it air dry, even when that meant hours of waiting before a show. On tour, she wrapped it in silk scarves to keep it from knotting during bus rides. Wind could turn a photo shoot into a mess. Stage lights could become hazards. Doors had to be approached carefully. Chairs, corners, costume hooks, and backstage clutter all became little threats. The hair looked magical from the audience, but from her side, it was work. Constant work. And that work wore on her. By the mid-1980s and into the 1990s, the sheer weight of her hair began to cause real pain. She dealt with headaches. She dealt with neck aches. Even combing it would become exhausting. Before some shows, the time spent washing and drying it left her drained before she even reached sound check. There were moments when the burden felt so heavy that cutting it must have seemed like relief itself. It was no longer just a style. It was something she carried, physically and emotionally, every day. Still, she held on. Part of the reason came from the people around her. Her fans had attached themselves to it. Her image had become so tied to it that the idea of cutting it felt almost unthinkable to them. And the strongest voice of all came from inside her own home. When she considered cutting it back, her daughter pushed back immediately. To her child, cutting that hair would mean cutting away something bigger than appearance. It would mean cutting away a piece of Crystal Gayle herself. That response stayed with her, and once again, the scissors stopped. She trimmed the ends year after year, but never gave up the symbol. That is what makes her hair story so powerful. It was never just about length. It was never just about beauty. It was a teenage promise, then a public trademark, then a burden, then a test of loyalty to herself. It outlasted record deals, trend shifts, different musical eras, and even the changing ways the industry looked at women. By the time she stood on major stages in later years, people still noticed it before almost anything else. Even when other artists honored her, even when crowds roared for her voice and her songs, the cameras kept drifting back to that impossible river of hair. At times, it seemed to shine almost as brightly as the career itself. And yet, the deeper truth is that the hair only became so iconic because Crystal herself gave it meaning. She turned inconvenience into identity. She turned pain into persistence. She turned something private into something unforgettable. That is why people never stopped talking about it. It was not just long. It lasted. And in lasting, it told the world something important about her. She could carry more than most people knew. That quiet strength did not begin with fame either. It began much earlier, in loss. Crystal Gayle was born Brenda Gayle Webb on January 9, 1951, in Paintsville, Kentucky, the youngest of 8 children. Her father, Melvin Ted Webb, worked in the coal mines, and the work slowly destroyed his health. The family lived with poverty, instability, and the constant pressure of survival. When she was still a child, they moved north to Indiana, hoping for better conditions and better chances. But the move did not erase what followed. Her father died when she was very young, and that loss settled into the center of the family. For Crystal, being the youngest only deepened the loneliness. One by one, her older siblings were already moving into their own lives, their own struggles, and their own ambitions. Some chased music, some chased distance, some simply disappeared into adulthood while she was still trying to understand what childhood even was. The house that should have felt full could suddenly feel empty, and in that silence, music became her refuge. It gave shape to feelings she did not have the words for. It gave her a place to put sorrow without having to explain it. That habit stayed with her for the rest of her life. While the public saw grace, polish, and calm, she often carried private grief underneath it. Family losses kept coming. Pain did not stop just because success arrived. Her brother J. Lee Webb struggled heavily, and the family had to carry that too. Other deaths followed in later years, and with each one, Crystal seemed to respond the same way. She would mourn, then return to the stage. She would cry in private, then stand in the spotlight as if nothing had happened. It was not coldness, it was survival. She had learned early that life did not pause for heartbreak, so she kept moving even when her heart was heavy. That same pattern showed up in her career. Even after she entered the music business, acceptance did not come easily. At first, she was introduced through the name everyone already knew. She was Loretta Lynn's younger sister. That label helped open a door, but it also trapped her in a very narrow space. Early on, the industry tried to shape her into a version of Loretta. The sound was pushed in that direction. The image was pushed in that direction. The message was clear. Be familiar. Be safe. Be the little sister. But Crystal could not live there forever. She respected Loretta deeply, yet she knew that if she stayed in that mold, she would never truly become herself. So she changed direction. She moved toward a smoother, softer sound. It still held country at its core, but it opened the door to pop. That shift changed everything. Songs like Wrong Road Again hinted at what was coming, and then Don't It Make My Brown Eyes Blue exploded. Suddenly, she was not standing in anyone's shadow. She was making a sound of her own. Still, the success came with a strange cost. Country purists thought she had gone too far toward pop. Pop listeners sometimes saw her as too country. She was winning, but she was also caught between worlds. That in-between place shaped her more than people realized. From the outside, it looked glamorous. She had the gowns, the long hair, the polished television appearances, the hit songs, and the growing reputation. But inside, there was always tension. She was trying to protect herself from grief, from comparison, from industry judgment, and from the pressure of always appearing untouched by any of it. The polished image worked, but it also became armor. It helped her stand there smiling while carrying things most people never saw. Through all of that, one relationship gave her steady ground. Long before the biggest tours and the platinum records, there was Bill Gatzimos. Their story began in high school in Wabash, Indiana, before Crystal Gayle was even Crystal Gayle to the world. At that point, she was still Brenda Gayle Webb, still young, still shy, still finding her way. Bill was not drawn in by fame because fame had not happened yet. He knew her before the image, before the success, before the pressure. That mattered. It meant their bond was built on something real from the start. They stayed together through those early, uncertain years, and when they married in 1971, they were stepping into a future that neither of them could fully predict. Crystal's career was only beginning. The path ahead was unstable. The early records were not doing what people had hoped. The comparisons to Loretta were constant. But Bill believed in her, and that belief became part of the foundation she stood on. When she needed to break away from the old image and risk a new sound, he was there. When the business became demanding and complicated, he did more than support her emotionally. He became part of the machinery that kept her life together. Eventually, Bill stepped fully into the role of manager, and that changed the shape of everything behind the scenes. While Crystal stood under the lights, Bill handled the pressure away from the stage. He dealt with contracts, bookings, negotiations, schedules, and all the noise that can swallow an artist whole. He took care of the business so she could focus on the music. That quiet work mattered more than most people noticed. The music industry is full of love stories that broke under stress, ego, alcohol, distance, and constant travel. Somehow, theirs did not. And one reason is that Bill never seemed interested in making himself part of the show. He stayed steady. He stayed useful. He stayed present. That steadiness became even more important once their family grew. Crystal was not only trying to be a singer with a successful career, she was also trying to be a wife, a mother, a daughter, and a sister, often all at the same time, while grief and obligation kept rising in the background. When children entered the picture, the balancing act became even more intense. There were tours, recordings, and public appearances, but there were also backstage feedings, rushed family moments, and the painful awareness that time at home was always limited. Bill helped hold that world together. He protected her space when life became too loud. He handled crises quietly. He made it possible for her to keep going. That is one reason their marriage stands out so much. In a world where so many country music relationships collapsed under pressure, theirs endured. It did not survive because they lived in fantasy. It survived because they built habits of loyalty and steadiness that were stronger than the chaos around them. Crystal had already seen how hard marriage could become through the lives of others close to her. She knew how fame could damage a home. So the fact that she and Bill remained intact year after year says something real about what they created together. It was not flashy. It was solid. Even with that support, one relationship remained especially complicated in the eyes of the public, and that was her bond with Loretta Lynn. From the outside, people were always eager to turn their connection into a simple story. They wanted easy rivalry, easy jealousy, easy headlines. But real family never works that neatly. Crystal loved Loretta deeply. Loretta helped open the first doors for her. There was admiration, gratitude, and history between them that could never be erased. At the same time, there were tensions that lived quietly beneath the surface for years. Some of those tensions came from the very thing that made Crystal successful. Once her crossover sound took off and her image became more glamorous, the contrast between the sisters only grew sharper. Loretta came to represent a rawer, more traditional kind of country truth. Crystal came to embody polish, softness, elegance, and crossover appeal. The public noticed, the industry noticed, and of course the family felt it too. That did not mean they stopped loving each other. It meant they were human. Sisters can admire one another and still bruise one another. They can stand on the same stage and still carry hurts no audience can see. For Crystal, that quiet ache stayed alive for years. She wanted approval. She wanted pride. She wanted to feel seen on her own terms, not simply measured against the family legend standing next to her. Sometimes the distance between them seemed emotional more than physical. They could share a moment publicly and still feel far apart in private. But even then, love remained underneath the strain. It never disappeared. It just lived beside the pain. That truth became even more moving in Loretta's final years. As time softened old tensions, Crystal stepped closer. What the public often missed was the tenderness that returned in those later days. The relationship was no longer about the old comparisons. It became about presence, memory, and care. After Loretta's health declined, Crystal showed up in ways that were deeply personal and far removed from cameras. The little sister who once lived in the giant shadow of a legend was now simply a sister again. That shift mattered. It gave space for something gentler. It gave room for forgiveness. And after Loretta's death, the loss seemed to settle into Crystal's life in a new way. Grief changed the color of things. It made the past feel closer. It made memory more active. It made family feel more important than ever. In that season of life, Crystal seemed to move even more clearly toward peace. The world still knew her as the woman with the hair, the hits, the glamour, the voice, and the elegance. But underneath all of that was someone who had spent a lifetime carrying sorrow carefully and turning it into song. That is why the image of her home in Nashville feels so fitting. After decades in the spotlight, after all the records, all the touring, all the scrutiny, she settled into a quieter life. Not a life of loud celebrity display, but one built around privacy, family, routine, and calm. Her home became less of a symbol of wealth and more of a symbol of refuge. It was the kind of place where a person who had spent so many years giving herself to audiences could finally exhale. And that quieter life makes sense when you look at the path behind her. She had already lived the hard parts. She had already known childhood loss, family pain, industry pressure, public expectation, and the strange loneliness that can live inside success. So the simplicity of her later years feels earned. Cooking at home, spending time with children and grandchildren, trimming the touring schedule, protecting peace, and choosing meaningful appearances over endless motion all reflect a woman who no longer needs noise to prove anything. Even her finances seem to tell the same story. She built a strong career, made smart choices, and lived without the kind of extravagance people often expect from stars. The success did not push her toward spectacle. Instead, it gave her the freedom to choose a softer life. That choice says a lot about who she really is. For someone who once spent years fighting to be recognized as her own person, peace may have become the greatest success of all. And that is really the thread connecting everything. The hair, the grief, the music, the marriage, the family, the quiet home, the careful life. None of these things stand alone. They all belong to the same story. A young girl from a struggling family learned to survive by holding on to what was hers. First it was her voice. Then it was her image. Then it was her sense of self. Along the way, she lost people, endured pressure, and built a life that could have easily broken under the weight of fame. But it did not. Crystal Gayle did not just become memorable because she looked different or sang beautifully. She became memorable because she carried herself through each chapter with a kind of quiet endurance that people could feel, even if they could not always name it. She made softness look strong. She made elegance look durable. She made survival look graceful.